Wait! I'm a what? Written by Artina Blackcharm. Chapter 11. Just typical crime boss activities. Summary. Although, is there really an agenda when he isn't even aware of it? To say that the residents were pleased with their efforts to prevent Danny from climbing the walls again would be an understatement. That, of course, wasn't to say that they didn't notice the slight glow in Danny's eyes when he got particularly excited. It was less a toxic green color and more a crystalline blue when he began to ramble about a planet or the story about a constellation on the hallway ceiling. His lighting up whenever the topic veered towards space, which with Danny was bound to happen, was much preferred than the 3-day trance. In fact, Danny looked healthier ever since making the observatory. He was still concerningly skinny, but he looked livelier and calmer in a sense. Something old man LJ called settled, as if there had been restrained energy underneath Danny's skin that had finally been able to escape. Where he before had flitted around, person to person, every day attending to needs and questions, he now lingered. That unknown thing that had pulled him away towards the next stop on a routine only Danny knew had seemingly disappeared. It didn't feel as if Danny was afraid to overstep his welcome. Instead, Danny would stop by the small gatherings that were about their neighborhood. He'd join in and listen, looking content as he can be, as the others talked about one of Catwoman's robberies or how they patched up a well-loved tent. He'd stay for an hour or two, just enjoying the company, whatever it was, in the alleyway sitting next to a dumpster on only a cupboard, leaning against the light pole late at night, a smoke trailed from multiple cigarettes, or sitting on the steps of a building. No matter where they were sequestered, no matter how often others had avoided looking in their direction, Danny would show up and keep them company. As much as Danny's assistance for little things and the occasional big ones was welcome, so was his company. To have a conversation where the fact that their appearance, their lack of employment, or their actual job was never brought into question or focus was a relief. To be simply treated as part of their neighborhood, even if it was just having someone stand by their side in silence. It gave a sense of normalcy that was taken for granted by a lot of people and rarely given to them living in this part of Gotham. Then he would look at Peace, a boy who at most looked like he was 17, but his eyes whispered of something much older. I looked not out of place in Gotham, except the Peace was. Rarely anyone found peace for long in their city, yet there Danny was, even if it might not have been the best thing for him to do. "You're too nice," Alicia had said while walking next to Danny, who had joined her after she finished up for the day. "Gonna get yourself hurt, even by just hanging around as sex workers." Alicia knew a lot of people who got hurt when they got involved. She heard the stories. She had been in them a couple of times. "I like hanging around," Danny said. "We're probably not the best influence on you," she said, and with her height she towered over him. It made him look younger than usual. "Not completely a safe business, you know," she added. "It's just your job. And it's not like you're not being safe, right? You take care of them." At the question, Alicia looked forward again. Her head was held a bit higher and her back straighter. "Right," she said sharply. "We're pretty much running it like Red Hood does. Proper procedures and shit." When Danny hummed in agreement, she released some of her tension before smiling. "Helps that you'll have driven the assholes away." She knocked her hip against him, and Danny returned the favor with a small smile. "Not like you don't already do. Veronica told me about how you stepped on a guy's nuts because he tried to mess with tricks. Bastard deserved it, but it's gotten better. Girls and I appreciate it." Danny waved it off, and Alicia didn't say anything else, As he dropped her off at the apartment door Veronica had opened. She had sauce on her cheek, no doubt from attempting a new recipe, and then, with a few words, he was walking off again. Alicia and Veronica watched him go and disappear around the hallway corner. Veronica finally ripped the sauce off her cheek with her thumb and tasted it. It needed some extra salt. He is a polite, itty-bitty boss, isn't he? Yeah, Alicia said. She knew how nasty things could have turned when Danny essentially claimed the neighborhood, though Danny never showed any hint that he didn't like how Alicia was running things. A bit unusual, but it is Gotham. Veronica laughed. You got that right. As Velen made his way back to the makeshift home he and Grundy had created underground, he heard voices, though nothing to make him hiss and ready his claws. Instead, as he walked further in, he was subjected to the sight of Grundy and Danny playing what looked like cards over their makeshift table. Danny slapped down a card with a force that almost made the crate stacked to make it wobble. He smiled smugly at Grundy. Grundy reached a hand down to grab Danny's foot. He pulled. Once again the little chit was held upside down. A card fell down from Danny's suspended hoodie. Cheater, Grundy said with a smile. Danny had just opened his mouth to respond, but his eyes caught sight of him. Hey, Valen! Valen set his bags down. How did this, he gestured to them, happen? I have regular card games with Grundy, Danny replied, happy as a calm as he still hung upside down over the table where the cards were set out. Grundy wins, Grundy said with a hint of smugness, and poked Danny's stomach. Danny squawked and crossed his arms as he swayed back and forth. Well, Grundy is a cheater. Grundy poked Danny again. Saturday is a bad cheater. Danny huffed dramatically, though he had a smile on his face. He pointed a finger at Grundy, which touched Grundy's finger. It was ridiculously smaller than the larger man's, and Grundy looked down at it with interest before grabbing the smaller finger. I will have you know, Mr. Solomon Grundy, Danny said, ignoring the hold on his finger. I can be downright sneaky if I have to. Grundy looked at the finger and Danny's face for a moment before looking over at Valen. Valen shook his head. Nah, looks like Saturday's just a sore loser. Loud laughter echoed around in the tunnel as Danny squawked again and used his other hand to express his offense, since the other was still being held. Though, eventually, Grundy's laughter died down, and he finally set the chit down on top of the table. Then he was shuffling the cards in his hands. As he watched Valen go towards some of the other things he had moved on the ground, including one table that didn't look like it would collapse if Danny laughed too loud while sitting on top of it. Slowly, he took out different items from the bag, and it wasn't long before an impressive collection of less than legal items was laid out on top of the table. Valen was counting how many handguns he had compared to the semi-automatic rifles when a voice piped up to his side, startling him. You gonna do anything with them? Danny asked. His voice was casual and his posture too, but he was oddly silent for that moment. His eyes eerily calm, looking at the weapons, almost in a critical sense, as if he were taking them apart piece by piece with just his eyes. Valen looked over them one more time, thinking back to how years ago he would have had the manpower and placed these weapons in their hands to carve out a place for him in the Gotham underworld. Except he looked back at Danny and over to where Grundy was shuffling cards with star designs on them. Ain't got a reason for them anymore, Valen finally replied. Oh, then can I have it? Danny was still looking at the table, his hands tucked in his pocket, like looking at an art museum, except this art could kill dozens with just one finger. And what you planning to do with all this shit? At this, Danny finally looked back up at him. Make a deal of it, he said, reminding Valen that Danny had apparently done a drug deal not too long ago. According to one of the little kiddies that run about, got a good chunk of cash out of getting rid of what apparently was nasty shit. Do you know how to contact one of Hood's guys? Danny asked. We can sell it to them, and from what I know, Hood is better at handling what's out on the street. Less chance of someone causing real trouble with it. Valen thought back to one of the few times he saw Hood in action, with re-educating some men. That, along with the fact that Danny's deal with one of Hood's guys earlier worked out. Yeah, Valen said. He knew Roy was close to Hood, and Roy did say he wanted him to message him more. I might just know someone. It made sense Danny had plans, likely smaller and less bloodier than the likes of the Red Hood, but plans nonetheless. Dad and Valen really didn't have use for the guns and the other items anymore. The table he had would be better for those card games Granty liked to play. So he messaged Roy. It worked out, birthstones and shit like that, as that saying went. Roy smiled as he looked at his phone. Valen had finally messaged him, and yes, it was about making a deal, but Roy would take what he could get. He was a good buddy like that. Valen had helped him out when he was at one of the worst points in his life. He had a lot to thank for Valen, and he always liked the big guy's company, even if he did have to keep dodging Valen's tail when Roy decided to be a little shit. It's part of his charm. Setting up the exchange was easy to do. Roy didn't even have to consult with Jay, able to just set it up with Matteo, with how simple it was. He knew Valen had a stash of things that were most likely in good quality. The guy had built up an impressive collection of things throughout the years, especially when he was set on taking over the underground. Valen had definitely mellowed out over the years, though, and from what Roy saw, was doing pretty good after getting out of Arkham. Valen had a little friend, some kid who glared at him, and funnily enough, acted protective about a 7-foot crocodile man. A perfect buddy for Valen, in Roy's opinion. A part of him wanted to tell Jason about the kid earlier, but the petty part of Roy couldn't resist keeping it to himself, seeing as Jay had no qualms about doing the same. But Roy would bet money that there was black hair underneath that hood the kid had worn in the dark tunnel, and blue eyes too, except Roy never did get a chance to put that money down, and he really wished he had made the bet with someone, because in the light of where they finally met up for the exchange 2 days later, Roy could see that the teen definitely had blue eyes and black hair. That, and it was the same kid that had gotten money out of Matteo with the whole finders keepers reasoning. You! Matteo had yelled and pointed when the kid had stepped out of the shadows, still wearing a big black raincoat with the hood up. The teen smiled at Matteo. Nice to see you again, he said, though when he looked towards Roy with a less than friendly look. Valen really did find a good friend in them. Kid, Matteo sighed. What are you doing here? I'm just a delivery boy this time, he said, as he pushed the bags that Valen had messaged Roy they would be given, filled with different goods. You take that, and I take back the cash. He pointed at Roy, should already know what the expected price is. It was amusing to see Matteo mentally struggle with something before slumping in resignation. Any deal with someone who looked as young as the teen did was a bit off-putting, especially considering Jay's rules about kids, except, in this case, taking weapons out of circulation, and some drugs too, was more pressing. Red Hood was effective in monitoring what was around in his streets. All right, Matteo nudged his head for Roy to get the bags, while he handed over the bag of cash to the teen. Just be careful with that. Lots of people would jump at a kid like you in a second, even if you ain't got shit to give them. The kid, and really Roy wished Valen had told him their name, nodded before somehow hiding the bag of cash underneath his raincoat. He didn't seem as scared with Matteo's warning. It's in safe hands. Matteo stared at them before walking over to Roy with a grimace. Swear you will give me a nice plot when Hood kills me? He asked, as he took the bag of goods from Roy. Roy smiled and patted Matteo's shoulder. He is really a sweetheart, Matteo. You will be fine. Ha! He's sweet on you. I will tell you that. But don't think the boss is on me, and I'm not even sure I'd want him to be, Matteo said. Though at the last part, he began to sound unsure of himself. Anyways, I'm bringing this shit back. You coming or what? Roy looked past Matteo at the teen. Nah, you go on. With that, Matteo left and Roy was left with the teen. So, you got a name? Silence. And a glare was his answer, reminiscent of the first meeting. You know what? Roy pulled out his phone. I'm gonna just call Waylon, so... Fortunately, Waylon picked up before the second ring and gave him a grunt and greeting as Roy put him on speaker. Waylon, buddy of mine, he said. Can you do me a favor and let the kid know I'm good? I'm kind of getting the stink eye right. And believe it or not, it's better than most I've seen. A laugh that could only come from Waylon came from the phone, and finally Waylon spoke. Jit, he's alright, a bit annoying, but he's good in my books. At Waylon's word, the tension disappeared completely, and Roy felt himself slunge in relief more than expected. Now, instead of a glare, the kid was just looking at him curiously. Alright, thanks for that, buddy. So glad to have your seal of approval, Roy said to Waylon. Waylon simply grunted again before hanging up, and Roy noted how Waylon didn't even told the chit to hurry back with the money. So, Roy said as he put away his phone, your name? If you don't already know, I'm Roy. I'm Saturday. The other finally responded. Well, nice to meet you, Saturday, Roy said, with a smile, happy to finally have the name of Waylon's new friend. Now I was thinking, you hungry? The difference of having Waylon's approval on how Saturday looked at him was amusing. Gone was the sharp gaze instead, replaced with curiosity, and what looked like amusement. Roy was glad to see that Waylon had someone who trusted his words that much, other than Grundy, of course. Saturday smiled. I could eat. It reminded him of Dick. The way that after a mission, or just hanging out after a day, he could ask that question, and with that smile, he knew what the next thing they would do was, in this case, was to hit up the nearest fast food place and get something that Alfred would have conniption if they ever tried to bring into his kitchen. It was nostalgic to see the same expression on Jay's face, one of the first times he had asked that, and Roy wondered if Jason was even aware of it. Now Roy could barely see Jay's face, with that red helmet, and he asked that question. But on Saturday it was clear as day, and it wasn't a hard decision to hit up Bad Burger. It was particularly a requirement for anyone in Gotham to go, especially as anyone as skinny as Saturday looked despite the big-ass raincoat covering him. Although no one even spared a glance at his outfit, which made sense considering the person who took their order had on a very ill-fitted Batman mask and cape. Soon enough they were seated at a booth in the back, Roy facing the exit, and Saturday looking at his tray of food with raised eyebrows. Roy didn't hesitate to start eating his food, and he wasn't about to urge Saturday to do the same, well aware of how people would react to any comment about their eating habits brought to focus. Though after Saturday finally began eating, he was curious about what the kid thought of the taste seeing as, from the looks of his face, it was the first time Saturday had been to a bad burger. "So how's the burger?" Saturday chewed a bit before swallowing, twisting his mouth as if he was ready to try to taste it before he responded with, "So right. Kind of used to the sauce being flammable, but this is nice too." He took another bite. "Flammable? You've eaten flammable sauce?" Roy asked, and a small part of him hoped that the condiment man never heard about this so-called sauce. So they took a bite of a fry, and suddenly his face looked worried for a moment. "I've eaten so many questionable things. The kitchen was a war zone. Revolutes, immunity, civilizations crumbling on those counters. Peace was never an option." He picked up his burger and took another bite. Once again, Roy was left with the question of where exactly Valen had found Saturday, or what felt more acute as Roy left after he finished eating with Saturday. Where did Saturday find Valen? Though Roy didn't admit it, he kind of understood how Matteo got led into doing a deal with Saturday, who had proposed finders keepers as his reasoning. For the small interaction he had in that bird burger, it made perfect sense. It was probably the reason why Valen was friends with the kid. It was probably why Roy was smiling as he actually used the front door this time to get into Jay's apartment. It had been fun, and it was even more fun considering the fact that Roy knew he knew something Jay didn't. Though he really did want to tell him, if just to see the reaction on Jay's face when he did. Jay's face was fun to look at, but Roy kept it together, kept the conversation towards a bunch of other little things when Jason finally showed up. Small talk, but he slipped in useful tidbits of info he knew Jay would appreciate. That along with messing with the man, the only way Roy was allowed to. Little by little, Roy would see the twitches in Jason's eyebrows, a quirk of his lip, clench of his jaw. He had learned how to cause each and every one of them throughout the years of knowing him. It wasn't long until Jason finally got up from where he was sitting and stalked over to Roy, though it wasn't the type of stalk that meant someone was going to be in a world of hurt. Instead, Jason stopped less than a foot away from him and grabbed Roy's chin. Carl's hands was against his skin in a secure hold that Roy did not feel the need to get away from. Instead, Roy just took a chance to get a closer look at Jason's face and how his eyes scanned Roy's face, and his hands moved his head around as if checking for something. Jason didn't even seem to notice how close they were and how Roy could particularly feel the heat coming from Jason's body. "Go take a shower." Those were Jason's words that finally broke the silence that had started when he got up. Words that Roy took a moment before he finally processed them. "Hey!" he said, but Jason had already turned around and walked away. "What you got there, Jed?" was the question Danny was met with when he finally met up again with Valen and Grunty. Danny smiled as he swung the bad burger to go back and gently in front of them. "The Killer Crocu Monstery sandwich," Grunty roared with laughter, while Valen just looked at him before shaking his head. Grunty had even come up to Danny to take the bag and then sat next to Valen as he took the sandwich out. The two had familiar ease in which the way they sat and talked, a conversation that mostly seemed to consist of Grunty poking fun at Valen. As Valen grumbled good-naturedly before taking the sandwich, Grunty was nudging towards him to casually try it. It had been a good day for Danny. The money he brought out from under his coat would be more than useful. There were a number of things he needed to fix up around his haunt. Big and small, over the past several months, he had done what he could do with what he had on hand, but some items required something a bit more specific that he'd probably had to get from a store and so on. It was a ridiculously long list to keep an apartment building up and running properly, especially with the cold months that were headed their way. Miss Shuney's blankets could only do so much. Also, Hood's guy, Matteo, had been truthful about what they planned to do with the drugs from the last time. Not an inkling of a lie or deception from when they struck the deal. Then he had learned more about the hunt, especially next door to his. It was an older, more established one, and it had been watched over well from what Snaps and the others had told him. Hood had a certain way of dealing with drugs, and it had worked. In Danny's hunt, there wasn't much of a drug problem like in Crime Alley, mostly because people who used were in Crime Alley, seeing as it was less likely they would end up using laced things and pulled into trouble by the dealers. Hood keeps them in line, Martin had said. Despite what others think, it's safer for him in Crime Alley when it comes to using. Of course, then he knew that some of Alicia's girl had used before, and Patty did say she wasn't a stranger to making deals. Then there were the kids who could tell him all about what was popular on the street that month, though they never tried it themselves, at least not willingly. Tick and Tack had made that painfully clear. Gotham City was a tough one, with a long and at times dark history. He could feel it in a way that the smell of tar, smoke, and other sounds of gunshots and whispers came up whenever he thought about it. But Gotham welcomed him. She was watchful and kind, a teasing city when it came to him mostly, but she was caring too. She did what she could for those who resided in the city, as much as she could do with the amount of curses that soaked her foundation. Then he could respect that. He wouldn't dare push his citizens to change into something they weren't. He would never think ill of those in his hunt, under his care. They were good people. Matteo had said Hood would be more than glad to deal properly with the drugs. The man's loyalty and respect he spoke with about Red Hood was impossible for Danny to ignore. Then there was Roy, who also had the respect, but also love, a deep care for the man he spoke about, a playful tone with the references he made, but nothing that could ever endanger or disrespect Hood. By all means, Red Hood was doing his best to take care of his haunt, and Gotham had loved him too. Her wonder showed in the gargoyles who stood watch, the joyful laughter slipped out of apartments, and the shadow cast when someone stood in front of another to protect them. It had only been right for Danny to accept that, too.